Hi everyone, it's Wendy, Megan, and Tammy, and we are going to go through The End of Average by Todd Rose. And the picture on the right represents what, as educators, we see as average, especially in the field of special education or evaluations. With the bell curve, everything in the middle is kind of the average, everything toward the left or the right starts to take a standard deviation or step away from the average. But what is average and who defines average? The average height of man, the average size of an American woman, the average SAT score, the average IQ. And if you don't meet the averages, are you not good enough or are you better than? And then there is the picture to the right. Beware the flaw of averages. What the little sign says is beware that the average depth of the river or lake is 3 feet. And obviously in this picture, there's an area that average is slightly off. So in Todd Rose's book, The End of Average, he exposes us to 4 key players in the evolution of average. The first one, Quetelet, gave us the idea of the average man. He was the first person to compute averages, which included average stature, average weight, the average age when couples married, the average age when people died, what average meant for poverty, and he also created BMI or body mass index. He also did some studies on suicide rates, for which he's quoted as saying the average man was suicidal to an average extent. That's a pretty significant quote when you think of suicidal rates. His work influenced people such as Florence Nightingale, Karl Marx, James Maxwell, and John Snow. Culture and immediate circumstances, he felt, drove behavior. One of the next people was Sir Francis Galton, who supported Quetelet's work except for the idea of the average man. He was more in tune with superiority and class rank and the idea of rank. There were 3 different areas or 3 different ranks that he identified. Those were imbeciles, mediocre, and eminent. And if your intelligence was eminent, then your physical health would be too, as well as your courage and honesty. He considered average to be mediocre, crude, and undistinguished. So the reverse of your intelligence being eminent and your physical health being eminent, as well as your courage and honesty, was educationally, if your math skills were low, your verbal skills would also be low, and as such, so would be your beauty and your self-discipline. Next was Frederick Taylor, who introduced the concept of standardization, and Rose quoted him as being one of the best ways to accomplish any given process, and only one way was the standardized way. Rose felt that this was a dehumanizing grind to keep the system first. And in fact, Taylor believed that you should standardize procedures, and by doing so, you could systematically eliminate the inefficiencies of business if you adopted the core concept of averagarianism. In the past, man was put first, but in the future, the system had to be put first. So standardization went from the factory setting and emerged into the school setting. And then the last person for the evolution of average was Edward Thorndike. He was very much in support of standardization or the Taylorization of schools. He helped prepare school superintendents. He also helped design assessments that would later determine or ascertain who was qualified for higher education. And schools, he felt, should clear the pathway for students who were really talented to move on to college and students who were considered average to work in an industrial setting. So the educational institutions, you'll see those 2 pictures on the right-hand side, clearly show that students with superior abilities, Thorndike believed, would become leaders of the country. The bulk of students were just average students, and they would go straight from high school into an industrial setting. And perhaps one of the things that was the most bone cutting for me was the comment about slow learners, that we should probably stop spending resources on them as soon as possible. And as I noted below at the bottom of the slide, this goes completely against our values and practices as leaders in the field of special education. And then the last portion would be the standardization of institutions under the Gary Plan. This was a Taylorist division, and you'll see more in the visual on the right, where it's the regulating department. We're going to standardize everything around the average. Students were divided into groups by their age, nothing about their performance, interest, or aptitude. And we would rotate those students through either a class or in the picture through a factory or assembly line. And this was kind of how the evolution came about for school bells, emulating the factory setting.
Rose identified 3 principles of individuality. I'm going to take some time to review these principles now. The jaggedness principle highlights the fact that humans are jagged, meaning we are rough around the edges, and applying one-dimensional, straightforward rules to all humans is not effective. In order to be jagged, 2 criteria must be met. There must be multiple dimensions, and these dimensions must only weakly relate to one another. The perfect example is Rose's above illustration, which man is bigger? By using one dimension, height, it is an easy answer. The first man is taller. But big does not just encompass height. What about girth? Then you would have to agree the second man is bigger. Human size is clearly multidimensional, and in this example, height and girth are just weakly related. Clearly, size is jagged. Another example, which as a basketball fan I could really appreciate, was when Isaiah Thomas took over as the owner of the New York Knicks. From his viewpoint, he believed that if he could recruit all the top scorers in the NBA and combine them on one team, he would clearly have the best team. He was able to achieve that goal and then found out quickly that only top scorers do not win games, because basketball is a multidimensional sport and talent is needed in all areas in order to win. If you consider mental abilities and the fact that intelligence is jagged, this could have a real impact on our educational system. The Gary Plan was devised according to age, and all students were taught the same standards. A one-dimensional approach was taken with a jagged idea, and the result was all students being compared to the concept of average, with background, abilities, or interests not being taken into consideration. But if the concept of average was taken away in schools, we would be left with a community of learners who progressed on an individual basis. How refreshing. The second principle is the context-dependent principle, which according to Rose is that behavior is dependent on both traits and situations and cannot be explained or predicted. Applying the if-then statement to all behaviors helps us to understand that all behaviors are dependent on the context in which they occur. Rose discusses how this could be a game changer for hiring practices. If employers would hire based on the talents they need for the particular position. Nearly every job description includes good communicator, but what needs to be communicated? A salesperson will communicate much differently than a preschool teacher. Considering the behaviors that we deal with in schools, it would be to everyone's benefit to truly take the time to understand our students' behaviors in the context of their background, need, and circumstances. For instance, stealing food from the cafeteria makes a lot more sense for a child who has no food in the house. Keeping the context in mind when dealing with behaviors at school could really benefit the students that we deal with. The last principle is the pathways principle, and this is simply that there are many different avenues to get to the same destination, and which road one takes is dependent on their individuality. Again, if the pathways principle was applied to our educational system, opportunities and experiences we could offer our students is remarkable, and with no average to compare to, there would be no need for special education. All students would be following their own path to success.
The idea of individuality and embracing this idea was first apparent in the business world. Big stores began to see positive changes when they applied the idea of individuality to their employees. They found that their workers were more productive, more engaged, and happier. This in turn created a more profitable business for them. It worked out to be a win-win situation for all, or, as Rose said, a path to a better society. When applied to the education world, Rose pointed out three ideas that could change the course of education as it had always been seen. While he spoke mostly about higher education, many of these principles could easily be applied to other areas of education. The three ideas were credentials, not diplomas, replacing grades with competency, and letting students determine their educational pathways. I found it interesting that Rose pointed out the system of credentialing in the Commonwealth of Virginia as an example of positive steps in the right direction. On page 179, he said these three concepts can help transform higher education from a system modeled after Taylorism factories that values their top-down hierarchy and standardization to a dynamic ecosystem where each student can pursue the education that suits her or him best. I work in the elementary world, so it's a little more difficult for me to see that, but in special education, you can see how involving students in their goal setting could be very helpful. In the world of special education, we spend a lot of time, the majority of our time actually, developing individualized plans, programs, and progress reports. Everything we do is about meeting individual needs of students. If we were to look at our students through the eyes of the averagarian, we would be defeating the purpose of what we do on a daily basis. Tailoring a plan to meet student needs means realizing that their strengths and talents are not necessarily bringing them to the same place as the average students. Rose really challenged us to look for the right fit for all students instead of seeing students as needing to get closer to the average. We began the book by looking at the Air Force cockpits and how they studied pilots' build rather than the usefulness of the cockpit itself. And we finished the book with the same idea. Kim Campbell was an Air Force pilot who stood 5'4" and weighed 120 pounds, far from the average pilot of the day, and she brought out the idea of creating a cockpit that could adjust to fit the pilot rather than trying to adjust the pilot to the cockpit. The idea that equal fit creates an equal opportunity for all should be bringing us closer to the alignment with our values, and it gives each of us the chance to become the very best that we can be. And it finishes up by talking about how we've gone from thinking that everyone needed equal opportunities to needing equal access to the types of opportunities we have, to developing equal fit, which would then create these opportunities for us. And in reality, thinking about equity in general. This book provided a thought-provoking look at how we as educators sometimes see our students. Do we continually compare them to the average student? And if so, who determines and how what is average? We spend much of our time developing individualized educational plans for students, but are we truly individualizing them? Within our own lives, do we see ourselves as average or above or below that standard? Rose discusses Kim Campbell's idea of fit creates opportunity, where we see the flaw in a system that brags of equal access. He proposes an idea of equal fit rather than equal access for all. To truly give all students equal opportunity, we must look through the lens of equal fit. We recommend this book to anyone working in the world of education, and we challenge them to throw out the idea of the average student and see every student as an individual.
Should you choose to use the end of average with your staff as a book study, here are some additional questions for thought. In what ways has society's focus on averages impacted you personally? In what ways does your school district rely on the notion of average? And in what ways does your school district work to genuinely support individual students' talent development?